Hey, well, good morning, everyone. And real quick, in celebration and honoring what Ryan's done, and Ryan, thank you for your courage in coming up and testifying to us. I know sometimes it's easy to sit and watch a baptism and be like, yeah, testimony, he got baptized, beautiful blessing by his mom, Dave baptized him, we clapped. And then it's kind of like, all right, swish LA for lunch. Something I'd invite you as a church to do is to recognize the sacred responsibility of being Ryan's family now, and to do something really simple. To take out your phone, open up the calendar, and on the 27th of each month, put a reminder to pray for Ryan. And then every Sunday after the 27th, when you see Ryan at church, just say, hey, brother, I'm praying for you. I'm praying that you would grow in your faith. I'm praying that you would know the strength and the power of the Spirit of God. That's a beautiful way for you as a church to journey with not just Ryan, but every individual that follows God in the obedience of baptism. So just a little thing for you. If you're like, who on earth is this ginger who thinks he can wear pink? I'm Luke. I'm the pastor of Outreach and Missions at Emmanuel Southbury, and I'm here because Dave was on vacation the last 2 weeks. I'm here as part of the Proverbs summer series we're going through, and in a moment we're going to be diving into Proverbs 16, but before we do that, I wonder if you could just take a little journey with me down memory lane to about 10 years ago in my life. I was just entering my 20s, young adulthood, and if you are a young adult, if you're anticipating being a young adult, or if you're remembering 10, 20, 30 more years ago being a young adult, you'll know that it's a time of anticipation, of expectancy, of thinking and dreaming a lot about what's next. Things like, where might I study in university, or what trade might I pursue? Maybe what part of the province or the nation or the world will I live in for my work? And that all-important, often overly consuming question, will I meet the one? Will I fall in love? So I was no exception to the rule in that matter. I was excited for school. I was excited for future opportunities. And I was like, man, I would love to be in love one day. I was seeing different peers who were dating and having great relationships and then getting engaged and then getting married. And I was like, this looks amazing. So I was like, man, it'd be sweet to have a girlfriend. So I started working intentionally in that direction. You know, I'm having conversations about it with others. I'm listening to wisdom and advice from older people. I'm reading the Song of Psalms, of course, as you should. And I'm just gearing my whole life in this direction. But I hit an obstacle. I hit a huge, massive, almost insurmountable obstacle, and that was this. Girls were saying no. Like straight up. Scenario would go like this. I'd be in like a community of young adults, and I'd meet somebody, and she was sweet and godly and beautiful, and we had some similar interests, and I'd think to myself, I think there's some potential here. And so as many of you in this room can relate to the emotional lead up to that, you kind of build up your courage and then say something like, you want to go to Timmy's? And these godly, beautiful, sweet, sincere young women would look me in the eye, smile sweetly, and say, not a chance! So there I was, broken-hearted, longing for one reality, but experiencing the exact opposite. Now, to make matters a little bit more miserable, to be honest, there were different people in my life and community, often happily married people, who, well-meaning, would see me, no frills, or like at the gym or in church, and they'd say, hey, Luke, how are you doing? And we'd strike up a conversation, and then they'd say something along these lines. Now, remind me, do you have a girlfriend? Just kind of like hangs out there. And I'd say, I'm playing the field. No, not quite. But they'd ask that question, and I'd say, well, not at the moment. I'm just kind of, single and trying to listen to God and all that good cliche stuff that we say. And they'd say, you know what, that's amazing, because you know what, Luke? I can't imagine, what's coming. I can't imagine how just like a sweet young man like you, I can't imagine how any gal could say no to dating a guy like you. And I'd say, actually, I'm 0 for 4. No, I wouldn't, but I thought it on a lot of occasions. Now, good news is, you're probably like, does he have a wedding ring on? Yes, I'm happily married now. Someone paid her under the table. It worked out. But what do you do in these moments where you're seeking one thing and you get another? Because here's the deal. Some of you in the room today, if you're honest with me, you're like, Luke, here's the deal, man. you're talking about romance and wanting to get a date to Starbucks, and that's nice, but if the only unwanted or unexpected response I was getting in life was no to a date, I would be thrilled. Because, Luke, you have no idea the universities I've applied to, and the answer's been no, and how crushing that is. Luke, you have no idea how hard I've worked to build relationships, either with people in my family or my community or my neighborhood, and how often people have just shut the door in my face, and it's so discouraging. Luke, I feel really talented and maybe even have degrees in a specific vocational space, and I keep applying for jobs in that work, and the answer is always no, or not yet. Luke, I've been faithfully working for a company for years, I've given everything I've got, and I just keep getting passed over for promotion. Luke, you don't even know what this summer has held. My family's been praying for someone for a health need, that God would show up, that God would do something good and restorative. And Luke, the exact opposite is the news we've received. It's devastating. So yeah, Luke, if the most unwanted or unexpected response I was getting was somebody just saying, no, I'm not going to go to Tim Hortons with you, that would be fabulous. Have you been there? Are you living in the midst of that right now, this space of saying, I long for something and I believe it's good. And I'm asking God to show up and to work. And for some maddening reason, the opposite keeps happening. Rejection, discouragement, an unwanted or a totally unexpected response. When those sort of things happen, it's really legitimate to be asking questions like, is God really for me? Is God going to journey with me through this? How is God working in the midst of this? This is why we sang, I don't know what you're doing, God. I know what you've done, but what are you doing right now? So in the midst of those, what does God have to say to our hearts and our lives? Well, that's where Proverbs 16 is going to help us this morning. If you're already there, that's fantastic. We're just going to look at 5 verses together, verses 1 to 4, and then we're going to hop ahead to verse 9 together in chapter 16 of Proverbs. It says this, to humans belong the plans of the heart, but from the Lord comes the proper answer of the tongue. All a person's ways seem pure to them, but motives are weighed by the Lord. Commit to the Lord whatever you do, and he will establish your plans. The Lord works out everything to its proper end, even the wicked for a day of disaster. In their hearts, humans plan their course, but the Lord establishes their steps. You may have noted that verse 1 and 9 have some interesting similarities with them, and they actually act as like these bookends to the verses we're studying together today. Because what's happening is that Solomon, who's writing this proverb, is wanting to differentiate between our heart desires and God's ultimate purposes. Look with me at verses 1 and 9 again real quick. They say this, to humans belong the plans of the heart, but from the Lord comes the proper answer of the tongue. And again, in their hearts, humans plan their course, but the Lord establishes their steps. Do you see what's going on? The commonality there is the theme of the heart. What's in our hearts? What are our hearts set on? What are we dreaming about, longing for, living for? What do we believe makes life worth living? Because that is what preoccupies our hearts. And Solomon's wanting to start to peel back the layers to say, what are you consumed with? What are you giving your heart to? Sociologists note that human beings are hardwired for belonging in community. And so as a result of this, from an early age, there's evidence even in little babies and toddlers, we're paying attention to social cues around us. We're watching our nuclear family, and as we get older, our friend group and broader community to figure out, what do I need to do in order to belong? And what do I need to not do that will cause me to potentially be rejected? We long for acceptance, to know that we're loved and welcomed. Now, what this means is that all through our lives, there's different identity markers, you could say, that people expect us to acquire and to meet. And this can change across cultures, and it certainly changes over the course of our lives. So, for example, if you are in grade 2, let's say we were in grade 2 together, an identity marker could be, are we or are we not fans of the kids' cartoon Paw Patrol? Like, can you sing all the lyrics to Disney's Frozen? Like, these are some of the identity markers that make you cool or in or belonging. Obviously, that evolves as you reach high school and evolves beyond that in young adulthood. Some of the young adults here know that belonging in their university campus can span a whole host of things. In one group, it could be how good are your grades. In another, it could be how physically attractive are you. In another, it could be how hard can you party, how much alcohol can you consume before you black out. But these things that it says, oh, if you can do this, if you can acquire this, if you can accomplish this, then you will belong. Then you will be accepted. Then you will matter. And so what that reveals is that our drive, our God-given drive for belonging and acceptance, often fuels and shapes our identity. Who we become, what we wear, how we talk, the way we spend our money, the people we spend time with, what we believe. And whatever we truly think is going to give us that robust sense of identity is usually what's on the throne of our hearts. So let me circle back to a couple minutes ago to talking about my longing for love. Now, longing for love is a really good thing. It's not a bad thing to desire to be married. Many of you here are happily married, and that's a great reality. But if I was honest in that season, I felt a bit of a tension knowing that what I longed for was good, but also realizing that being single was not as exciting as being in a relationship. That sometimes people are like, oh, you're single? What? We've seen that, don't we? And so there's this part of me that said, man, if I had a girlfriend, that means I'm wanted. That means I'm desirable. That means at a very personal level, I am lovingly accepted. It can make it hard to not build your identity around being in a relationship. It might not just be romance, though. You could look to a whole bunch of different things that we look to say, man, if my identity is wrapped up in this, if I can just be known for this, then I'll be loved, then I'll be valued. I mean, think about it. We do this with sports all the time. We do this with body image. We do this with wealth. We do this with social status and popularity. The list could go on and on. We say, if I get this, then I will belong. Then people will respect me. Then people will love me. And so this proverb is actually probing our deepest values, our greatest loves, and our ultimate passions. The text is actually trying to reveal what our lives are built around. And it's asking really a question along the lines of saying, who or what do we believe will fulfill our greatest longings, rescue us from our biggest failures, and actually satisfy our deepest needs? Solomon's inviting us to just be really, really honest with ourselves and with God and to say, what's actually on the throne of my heart today? Have I maybe misplaced my identity? You might be saying, well, Luke, maybe I have. I'm not totally sure. I mean, there's lots of good things in my life that I want to pursue. How do I figure out if I've actually misplaced my identity, if I'm actually building my life around something other than an intimate relationship with the living God? Two themes I want to draw out. The first is these themes of grief and guilt, and the second is gluttony and angst. Where am I going with this? Well, grief and guilt because if we are pursuing something that we believe will ultimately give our lives meaning, that will ultimately allow us to belong, and we don't get it, we're consumed by grief and guilt. Conversely, if we do get that thing we believe will make our life matter, we're consumed by gluttony and angst. Two examples to help you unpack this. When I was in university, I had the opportunity to try out for the varsity men's soccer team with about 8 or 10 other guys. There was another guy who'd recently come to the school, was also hoping to try out for and make the varsity soccer team, and had a ton of potential. He was hardworking, he was pretty athletic, he was also a little bit cocky, and as the weeks approaching the tryout came closer and closer, he was kind of talking more and more confidently about being on the team before actually making the team. Well, the week of the tryout came and the different training sessions happened, and at the end of the week, the roster was posted and he didn't make the cut. He wasn't accepted on the team. Friends, this guy stopped talking to any soccer players, stopped playing pickup soccer with other people. He just shut down, and a few weeks later, as the semester ended, he notified school authorities that he would be leaving the school. He ended up moving from the state to a totally different part of the country to start all over again. Seems a bit extreme. What's happening? Well, for this guy, he built his identity around being an athlete, being a soccer player, wanting to be a varsity athlete. And he was so confident that if he made this team, then he would belong. Then he'd have value. Then he'd matter. That when he didn't, it crushed him. He was overwhelmed by this grief and guilt. Sadness that he didn't make the team and questions of his own value. Am I not good enough? Where did I mess up? And it totally got him down right at the knees. Why? Because when we put our identity in something that we believe will ultimately bring meaning and value to our lives, that allows us to belong, and we don't get it, we're consumed by grief and guilt. On the other hand, though, what happens when we do get that? What happens when that thing that our heart says, this is everything, this is supreme? When we do get that thing or that relationship, what happens? It's the opposite. We're consumed with gluttony and angst. Right around the time I finished university, I was a part of a young adults community, and all of us, like many of you graduating university, were dirt poor, right? Like you're pinching pennies, you're driving old cars, you're thrifting like a boss, right? You're trying to make financial ends meet well. And inexplicably, one of our peers, who was in the same kind of financial boat as us, went out and bought a brand new Corvette. And we were just like shocked. We're like, oh my goodness, what is going on? This guy, brand new Corvette. And over the first 1, 2, 3 months of him having this vehicle, it was like he was the talk of the town. He'd pull up somewhere and people would want to come out and see his car and talk to him and ask him if they could drive it or at least, be a passenger while he drove it. And they'd want to look at the engine. And it was such a big deal. And for a few months, this guy had this incredible sense of significance and belonging and importance. But 3, 4 months in, it became old news. Everybody'd gone for a ride. Everybody checked out the engine. Everybody knew this dude had a Corvette. And people started to move on. People didn't get up out of their seats to come find him in the parking lot anymore when he drove in. Friends, less than 6 months after getting the Corvette, he traded it in for a totally different brand new vehicle. Why? What's going on? Because he's saying, I have to have this car so that the people around me will say, you matter, you belong, you're important. And once the significance of that wears off, what happens? Well, first, I'm afraid, I'm anxious, oh no, I've got to now do something else to recapture the attention of people around me. So what do? I trade in that car, I get another new car in hopes that, again, people will be focused on me. Do you see it? When we do get what we want, that we think will give us that sense of value, acceptance, belonging, it leads to this gluttony and angst. We're afraid. What happens if we lose the attention we're getting and I need to get more? Another new car, another girlfriend, another pay increase, another fill in the blank. So this is why Solomon is kindly, but pretty candidly pointing to the core of our being, pointing to our hearts. So where do we go if we're realizing, okay, yeah, maybe on the throne of my heart is something or someone other than Jesus Christ. Maybe my sense of identity and worth is built around a reality that isn't firstly on him. What are some of the things that I need to start to embrace so that I can have a reorientation of my heart, a reorientation of my purpose and values and what I'm ultimately living for? Well, verses 2, 3, and 4 are going to give us a snapshot of what those realities are, inviting us to consider 3 themes. 1, humility. 2, surrender. And 3, trust. So let's look at verse 2 and this theme of humility together. It says this, all a person's ways seem pure to them, but motives are weighed by the Lord. And I really like what Eugene Peterson says in the Message translation. He says, humans are satisfied with whatever looks good, but God probes for what is good. So God, he's like a miner that is not content just to stay on the outside of the mountain with gravel and shale, but is delving in to the heart of things, seeking out those precious stones. He's wanting to get to the core elements of a matter or of a person's life to say, what's really going on here? Are your motives pure? Are your motives anchored in God? Are you motivated by the right realities? And the truth is, we actually desperately need God to invade our hearts and expose what's in our hearts. Because as human beings, we're painfully prone to rationalize our behavior, to justification. You just take a cursory look through the Bible, and you can see this again and again. Cain murders his brother Abel. What's Cain famous for? Am I my brother's keeper? Rationalizing behavior. Like, this is not my responsibility. You just killed the guy. What about Abraham and Sarah? He's like traveling around in different kingdoms. He's got a really attractive wife. He's like, they're going to kill me so they can marry my wife. What does he do? He lies. She's like just my sister. Puts her in a really vulnerable place. Why? Self-justifying behavior. What about Saul? Even though David's anointed to be the next king, and Saul is like trying again and again and again to kill him. Probably the most famous example of this in the New Testament is Pontius Pilate. He's responsible to provide justice, to condemn the guilty, and to set free the innocent. And Jesus is brought before him. And he says, I think this guy's innocent. But the crowd is so loud and so demanding. What is Pilate famous for? Bringing out a basin of water, washing his hands, and say, I'm innocent of this man's blood. No, he's not. He's the authority figure responsible to make sure justice is carried out. Self-justifying behavior. What really is at the core of our hearts. Humans are satisfied with whatever looks good, but God probes for what is good. Last summer, I was driving down Mapleview and Barrie towards Park Place Plaza, and as can be the case from time to time, there was a homeless man with a sign on the central median. And so I went to that most religious of restaurants, the Burger's Priest, and got this guy a full meal, takeout in a bag, crossed the crosswalk to the median, and was giving him this food and just kind of like shaking his hand as I did it. And I had this like moment in my mind, and I thought, wouldn't it be great if somebody from Emmanuel drove by and saw this? Wouldn't it be great if an elder from Emmanuel drove by? Here's Luke, our pastor of outreach, handing a full meal to this homeless man, shaking his hand, going out of his way to love. Wouldn't it be great if they took a picture of me and maybe shared it with the staff or the elders like later this month? It was over in about 3 or 4 seconds. But this moment of suddenly realizing, wow, what's truly in my heart? If Mapleview was empty and there was nobody on it, would I have still pulled off and helped this person? What's actually motivating me to do something good? This is what this verse is really getting at. It should make us think of the passage in Psalms that says, search me, God, know my heart, test me, know my anxious thoughts, see if there's any offensive way in me, and lead me in your way of everlasting life. God, humble us to invite you to reorient our hearts by purifying the motives of why we do what we do, especially in the service of others. We look at verse 3, there's this theme of surrender. And if I were to say to you, what do you think the most famous passage in Proverbs would be? I think you'd probably say Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Don't lean on your own understanding. In all your ways submit or surrender to him, and he will make your paths straight. And so it's not a one-off. It's actually a motif that emerges throughout Proverbs and is here again in Proverbs 16 when it says, commit to the Lord whatever you do, and he will establish your plans. Now, I should say, this is not meant to be like a Bible life formula hack, all right? What I mean by that is that some people read this verse and then they say, okay, here we go. I am starting university and I'm going to commit my courses to God. I'm going to commit my whole degree to God. And because I'm committing this to God, there's no chance that I could fail a class or have to, at some point, redirect my academic studies to a different field. People will say, I'm starting into this dating relationship. I'm going to commit it now at the front end to God, and that means we're getting married. Or I'm stepping into this brand new job. I'm going to commit it to God, and if I've committed it to God, that means I won't ever get fired, or a company won't ever go bankrupt. That's not what this proverb is getting at. It's rather inviting us to be a people of daily, moment-by-moment surrender to God, of saying, in everything, God, I want your purposes to be accomplished here. In success, in struggle, in failure, in joy, I'm again wanting to say, I'm dedicating my life to you, because my ultimate purpose is to know and love and honor you in this. There's this old school commentary on a dude named Tremper Longman, and he writes this, the quote's on the screen. It says, all planning should be done in recognition that God can indeed overturn it. The thought is not that we simply pray for God to honor our plans and to establish them. Rather, it's the idea that we submit our entire life's action to God, so that even if our human plans are subverted, we can recognize an even deeper plan at work in our lives. If the, quote, acts are already accomplished, then the idea is that even when a plan has reached fruition, we must still trust God for its success. So how do we embrace a heart posture of surrender? I'm helped in this by thinking about a ship with a sail that is out on the open sea. If you've done any sailing or even just like simple boating this summer, you'll know that if you don't put down an anchor, it doesn't take very long for the wind or the current to start to redirect the direction that your watercraft is going in. Many of you have been there. And so you'll know that if you're going on a long trip, if you're canoeing a long distance, or especially if you're boating, especially under the power of sails somewhere, what you're constantly doing is like checking your compass, checking your GPS, and making little course corrections. Ideally you never have to do a 180, but little, 5 degrees, 7 degrees, 2 degrees, just to make sure you're keeping on target for the destination you're headed for. That's what this verse is getting at, is saying we want to be a people not only of one-time dedication, but of faithful rededication. We're constantly making those little course corrections that are marked by a daily posture towards God that say, Lord, again, today, I'm dedicating my life to you, my marriage to you, my work to you, my finances to you, my relationships to you. You fill in the blank. I'm again wanting to rededicate myself to you, to commit myself to you, trusting that as I make you true north, you'll continue to accomplish your good purposes through my life. Your kingdom vision will succeed in and through me. It's an invitation to dedication and rededication. So you might be here saying, okay, Luke, I got to be square with you, man. I'm not a huge fan of verse 4 because, yes, like we talked about in verse 2, I've sought to be a person of humility. Like we just talked about in verse 3, I've sought to be a person that is surrendered to God. And now verse 4 says God is working out everything for his ends, even the wicked for a day of disaster. And it seems to me that there's some intense stuff going on there with regards to the justice of God. Because if you were honest with me here, there might be a part of you that says, on the one hand, Luke, talking about Judgment Day or God's punishment for the wicked, it makes me feel a bit uneasy. What do we do in that space? Because often our culture says, well, a God who loves us, who's compassionate, who's tender towards us, yeah, we can jump on board that train. But a God who holds people accountable for their lives, especially the wicked, for what they've done that condemns themselves, what do we do with that? Well, something that's helped me understand this is the good old classic film, The Princess Bride. Just by a show of hands, how many here have seen The Princess Bride? Oh yeah, good, okay, so 60 to 70%. If you don't know The Princess Bride, you should probably watch it. That's not a discipleship note, it's just a fun note. The Princess Bride is known as having a main plot between Princess Buttercup and Wesley, who are trying to find each other and rekindle their love. But what I want to talk with you about is a secondary plot, which is every bit as gripping, including a swordsman by the name of, you know him? Inigo Montoya, thank you, who's famous for saying, you've seen this on the little welcome cards at conferences, like the name tags, hello, my name is, and it'll say Inigo Montoya, prepare to die. I know it's very cliche now, but people will do it. That's what it's from. Inigo Montoya's father is murdered by the six-figured man. And Inigo spends his life training as a swordsman to seek justice, vengeance, to avenge his father by killing the six-figured man. Now, due to a host of circumstances, including losing a duel, which he is not killed in, Inigo loses his confidence, his sense of mission and purpose, and he falls into despair that justice can never be served. And so partway through the film, Fezzik, the giant, finds Inigo Montoya totally drunk and hopelessly given up on life and any hope of somehow avenging his father's name. Now, with the support of Fezzik the giant and other key characters, Inigo not only overcomes his, drunkenness and returns to seeking vengeance, but he ultimately, spoiler warning, finds the six-figured man, has an epic duel with him, and kills him, avenging his father's name. Now, if we are only using human logic and looking from a human perspective, it feels kind of good. Here's this guy, his dad's killed when he's a child. He gives his life to avenging his father. He overcomes all these odds. Friends come around him to remind him of his purpose and vision, and he rises to the challenge and kills that evil man. And we're like, yeah, take him out. But what happens when you introduce the gospel into this equation? Because here's the deal. Inigo Montoya shows us the two extremes that we as humans will ultimately fall into unless there is a good and just God who will bring the wicked to judgment. And these are the two extremes. The one is hopelessness and despair. We look at the world around us, we see how incredible, there's just so much injustice everywhere. We don't even know where to start around the world, let alone in our own city. And we just are crushed by the weight of how much brokenness there is around us, and all we have left to do is to feel overwhelmed and to give in to despair, that there's no hope of justice. On the flip side, and Inigo does that in his drunken state, but on the flip side, we look at the world around us, we see all the injustice in the world and in our own city and that's impacting our own lives, and we say, okay, it's on us. It's our responsibility. We have to exact punishments. We have to mete out justice. We have to take people to task for what they've done. And that leads to violence. That leads to extremism. Think of the Wild West. It's like, well, you offended me, I'm going to kill you. And then your brother's going to kill me, and then my brother's going to kill it. And you descend into violence. We've just seen this last week in the news with Prigozhin, the Wagner mercenary leader, who's like, I'm going to make a coup. Remember? A couple months ago? And Putin's like, no, you're not. And he's like, all right, I'm going to go hang out in Belarus. What happened on Wednesday? His plane was shot down. This is what happens when we take justice into our own hands. And so this verse, Proverbs 16:4, when it says God works out everything for his own ends, even the wicked for a day of disaster should give us hope, because it invites us to say, in the face of injustice, we don't have to give way to despair, because we realize that God is going to bring justice, that he's shown us what justice looks like in Jesus Christ. And so we can work even now to live in a way that inaugurates his justice in the way that we live and love and serve. But at the same time, even as we advocate for the inauguration of justice, we realize that we deserve justice ourselves, but that God has been infinitely gracious to us in Jesus Christ, that we should be punished. And that gracious reality keeps us from saying it's our responsibility to go after and destroy unjust people. We recognize that it is God's responsibility to hold them accountable for their actions. This is why a verse like this that touches on the justice of God should encourage us. But here's the thing, as you reflect on that, you might say, Luke, that's all fine and good, but what about my life right now in the spaces where I'm experiencing injustice? What about those spheres of my workplace where the HR department just can't do anything to sort out something with a really difficult coworker? Now, what about a neighbor who's just awful? What about a family member who's mistreated me? Because for many of us in this room, if we're honest and we reflect even just on the last few years of our life, we can think of scenarios where we have been badly mistreated. Maybe it was in relationship. Maybe it was in a broken commitment of trust. Maybe it was in finances. I don't know, but many of us can relate to those places of saying, this is so unjust. Where is God in this matter? I've asked that question a ton myself. And if I'm honest with you, I still feel like I'm working towards a sound answer in the midst of that. How is God, as verse 4 says, actually working out everything for his own ends? Two things that have encouraged me that I just would give to you to encourage you is to realize that God knows the beginning from the end, and he is writing the final chapter of the story. And these moments of injustice are a chapter in the story, but they're not the end of our life stories. The second thing I would say is to point you to the life of Joseph and his story in Genesis. A person who, as you may know, is sold into slavery by his brothers, falsely accused and imprisoned, experiences over 12 years in some form of oppression. And then God raises him up to be the second most powerful person in the land and to enact an economic reform that saves the region from famine a few years later. And when his brothers, who sold him into slavery, reconnect with him, Joseph has these famous words. He says, what you intended for evil, God used for good, for the saving of many lives. And so I share that with you because I've prayed that many times. I've said, Lord, you see what this person has done, or you see what's gone on here. You see the injustice in this matter. You are working out everything for your own ends, and so I want to ask that what this person has intended for evil in my life, that you would use for good. And I invite you to pray that as well. So at the outset of our conversation together, we asked the question, what do we do when we receive an unwanted or an unexpected answer? What's God up to in the midst of that? And I think we need to realize that our response is to embrace the truth that God actually has the last word. Now, that's terrifying if God is a disconnected, disinterested dictator, but he's not. He's a real, compassionate, loving, and truthful God. And God's final word is the living word, Jesus Christ. That's God's final word, not just to us in our everyday realities, but to the world in the cosmic scope of history, that the final word is and will be King Jesus. Why does this matter for us in light of Proverbs 16, and what is on the throne of our hearts? In 2 Corinthians 5, Paul writes about Jesus that God made him who knew no sin to be sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God in him. He doesn't say God made him who knew no sin to be sinful, but to be sin for us. What's happening? It's this incredible exchange of everything that is identified with Christ, his holiness, purity, love, goodness. Everything that defines who he is exchanged with everything broken and sinful and impure that defines who we are. And so God takes everything fractured and broken in our lives and allows Christ to be defined by that on the cross so that we can be defined by everything good and pure and excellent and holy that he is, so that we can be accepted into his forever family. This is like beautiful and has eternal implications for our lives and should be a source of just like, because we're sons and daughters in Christ. We're loved. We're received. We're accepted. We're justified. We're embraced. We don't have to ask the question, am I loved? Do I belong? What do I need to acquire? This is God giving us every blessings in the heavenly realms that he's given to Jesus Christ. He gives to us. In a simple way, Jesus takes everything wrong with us and gives us everything right with him so that we can be right with God. So what does this mean for our everyday lives as we consider our hearts and our identities and what we're living towards and what we believe really gives us value? Let me use the example of aging, all right? Not to pick on older people. I'm just saying that to use this example of aging to help us with this. If you're a woman in the room, you know there is crushing expectation to constantly look like you're 21, even when you're 31 or 41 or 61 or 81. And you might find yourself saying, man, when did I go from stilettos to like slip-on? It feels like who I need to appear to be in order to be valued is an impossible distance away. And it's exhausting trying to keep up with the expectations of culture on me. Guys, what about guys? Think for a second. Maybe you're 55 and you feel like you need to have the athleticism of when you were 25. But you just don't have that same energy and vigor that you used to have. Maybe you're thinking about your life and you're saying, when did I go from playing doubles tennis, singles tennis, to doubles pickleball, right? You're at this place of realizing I just don't have what I used to have. And it can be exhausting to try and keep up with those demands. This is God saying, you are mine. In Jesus Christ, you're loved. You're accepted. Your identity is secure. If he is on the throne of your heart, if he's the one who defines your identity, everything else is secondary. So whether or not you have the biggest income, it's secondary. You belong to Christ. Whether or not you're the best looking or most athletic or fill in the blank in the room, it's secondary. You belong to Christ. You can rest in your identity as a son or daughter of God. You don't have to be constantly running on the world's treadmill that is so anxiety-producing to achieve, to accomplish, to acquire. This is why it's beautiful in Romans 8:15 that it says, we are no longer slaves to fear. We're children of God. We're children of God. Ryan this morning was baptized to say, I'm getting off that treadmill. No, I've gotten off it. I'm not a slave to the world's ways or perspectives or values. I'm a son of God. And that's an invitation to all of us here to stop and say, what's on the throne of my heart? Will I receive this new identity that Christ gives me, everything good for everything bad that I am, so that I can belong permanently in his family? To close, you might be saying, okay, Luke, yes, that sounds awesome. I want to be somebody who steps into that relationship. I hear the merit of that. There's so much wisdom out there. There's joy in the reality, as Tim Keller would say, that our identity in Christ is not achieved, it's received. And because we've received this, we live in obedience to God. But Luke, does that mean I just throw in the towel on ambition? Does that mean I just give up on being successful? Does that mean I don't try to excel in my work, or I don't aspire to be good looking, or I don't seek to be fit and athletic? Does that mean I just quit on all those things? It's all right, sitting on a couch eating potato chips, I'm accepted. Is that what I do? No, I don't think it is. David Jeremiah says success is actually fulfilling God's will for your life. But all of us have a dream for our lives, but not all of those dreams are interwoven with God's kingdom purposes. So where do we start? With humility, surrender, and trust. We let those characteristics define who we are and what we're living for. We let Christ be the king in our hearts. We let our identity as forgiven and redeemed sons and daughters propel every aspect of our lives. To close, I want to leave you with a few verses from Philippians 2, because I feel like this passage encapsulates humility, surrender, and trust in the life of Christ. And his example and his life in us is what fuels our lives as well. Jesus, being in the very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing, humility, taking the very nature of a servant, being found in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient, surrender, to death, even death on a cross. What incredible trust. Therefore, God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. God, thank you for this incredible community of men and women here at Emmanuel Aurelia. Thank you for the invitation you've given us in your word today to be a people who invite you to examine our hearts, to expose what's really there. Lord, in those spaces where we have made something or someone ultimate, we ask that you would reorient our hearts, that you would not only allow us to know the beauty and the forgiveness of Jesus as King, but that our greatest ambition would be to live for and honor him. So help us to follow this example of Christ we see, to be a people of humility, a people of surrender, and a people of trust, that the name of Jesus would be exalted in our lives in every way as we step into the fall and all that it holds. Amen.